Welcome to episode 2 of the third series of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. It's such a pleasure to be back with you, and we've got I wouldn't say a lot, but we've got a fair selection of very interesting things from my library today, and I'm going to share them with you and try and give you as much background information as I can. You know, I love talking about the pieces in my library, and I can bore you all to death and keep you going for year after year with episodes of this Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. You'll be coming back to me in the 20th series of episodes of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. We'll still be talking about things, and I'll still have plenty more to talk about. This episode, it's the second episode, is sponsored by George and Susie Fishman. Thank you so much, George and Susie. It's in memory of Susie's father, Laszlo Weiss. Shmuel ben Yosef Halevi Zichrono Livrocha's yahrzeit is on the 17th of Iyar. We wish you that the neshama should have an aliyah. We should be zeicha to see techias hamesim. I'm going to begin by talking about a fantastic piece. This is really a remarkable piece. It's going to take me a long time to get to where I want to get to with it, but here we go. So here is the piece. It's a very nondescript looking brown leather book. It's the first book that we're going to be talking about today. It's the history of three late famous imposters. Here's the title page. The history of, it's not even a Hebrew book, right? Here's the book, and I know that Carly, when she puts the video up online, is going to put an image up so you can see it properly. The history of three late famous imposters. It's by the 17th century English writer John Evelyn. So this book, this nondescript little book, which I'm going to be talking about now, and before I tell you about it, and it's a fascinating book. You'll really be interested to hear about the contents. But before we get there, let me share a few words about John Evelyn. And let's first show you an image of John Evelyn. Can you see that there? There's an image. It's a portrait that was painted of John Evelyn. He was born in 1620. He died in 1706. He was a diarist. Now, let me tell you a little bit about diarists. People who write diaries, they're very important because they reveal a lot about social history. Because they're not writing in official books and documents, they're writing about their lives. The most famous diarist of the 17th century in England was, of course, Samuel Pepys, without any question whatsoever. But not very far behind him was this fellow, John Evelyn. He's, of course, far less well known and not as celebrated. But let me tell you about Evelyn, because Samuel Pepys was a civil servant. He worked in bureaucracy. He worked in the Ministry of Naval Affairs for the British government. And that's really what he spent most of his time doing. And everything else that he did, he recorded in his diary. But that's what he published. You know, that's what we know about Samuel Pepys. But John Evelyn authored no less than 30 books on diverse topics, from art to forestry and gardening, religious topics, whatever you can imagine, he wrote about. He also wrote about social issues, including curious contemporary vignettes, such as the ones which are contained in this book, and I'm going to talk to you about in a moment. And he wrote also this extensive, detailed diary from the age of 11 until shortly before he died. It wasn't published until 1818. I told you he died in 1706. So it was more than 100 years after he died that the diary was published. You can find it online. I think that if you want to find it without buying a published copy, it's available online. Now, Evelyn's diary is considered, according to Britannica, an invaluable source of information on the social, cultural, religious and political life of 17th century England. Evelyn was a royalist. I don't know if you know what that means, but it means he was a supporter of the English monarchy against the rebellion of Parliament that took place in his lifetime. And he had to run away from England when it became a republic. For about a decade, just a little bit more than a decade, that England was a republic in the middle of the 1600s under a fellow called Oliver Cromwell. We've spoken about him before because, of course, he was the one who readmitted Jews into England, which was a very important move. Anyway, during that time, the time that he had to run away from England. He lived in Europe, in various different places in Europe, and he kept up his friendship with Charles II, who was the son of the executed King Charles I, who'd been executed by Cromwell. And he came back to London with Charles II when the monarchy was re-established in 1660. So his fortunes were relevant with regard to the monarchy first being deposed and then being brought back to England. Now, interestingly, Evelyn was very friendly with his fellow diarist, Samuel Pepys, and they worked together as government officials because after he came back, by the way, all the friends of Charles II during the time that he was in exile were given jobs and posts in government when they came back from Europe when the monarchy was re-established. And John Evelyn was one of those people. In fact, he worked in the Forestry Commission, and that's why he wrote about forestry. He wrote about, more than forestry, he wrote about how to keep trees alive and how to keep forests vibrant. That's another story. But I always wonder if when he was working together with Samuel Pepys, they spoke about the fact that they both were writing diaries, or whether they had absolutely no idea that the other was writing a diary, because of course diaries are secret. We have two portraits of John Evelyn. The first one is the one I showed you. Here it is again. It's showing him as a young man. It was by the German Baroque painter Hendrik van der Bocht, the younger, or the second. His father was also a very famous artist. This second one, which I'm about to show you, the second one here, can you see that there? The second one was painted much later in Evelyn's life. It's by Sir Godfrey Kneller, who's also a German. Originally Gottfried Kniller. He was born in Lubeck in the year 1646. What's interesting is that he moved to England. He died in 1723, and for the last few decades of his life, he was the leading portrait painter for in London for the royal family and for the aristocracy. He was painting kings and queens. He also painted, there's 4 very famous paintings of Sir Isaac Newton, and Kneller painted those as well, those portraits. Now I'm telling you all of this because it sounds like completely irrelevant treasures from a rabbi's library. You're expecting Sforim and Jewish stuff. The reason I'm telling you all of this is just to give you a sense that John Evelyn, who this little book here was published by and written by, was a man who mixed in the highest circles of British royalty and aristocracy, which makes the topic of this book so much more curious. And you're probably wondering why I'm so excited about this book. Well, first of all, let me tell you, I snapped it up during the COVID pandemic. So while I was delivering the first series of treasures from the Rabbi's Library, I bought this book. And it's a book, this little book doesn't come up very often. And I'll tell you about that in a moment. It's a beautiful copy. It's bound in original calf leather, published in London in 1669. And this copy, this little book here, belonged to the lawyer Robert S. Peary, better known as Bob Peary. I have an image of him here. This is Peary. Yeah, I think in around 1980. Can you see that there? This is Bob Peary. And I have a book plate, actually, an image of his book plate. It's taken from the book. But I'm going to show it to you. Here it is in the book. Can you see it there? And I'm going to show you an image of his book plate. It's important because he was a very famous bibliophile. By the way, the S in Robert Peary's name didn't actually stand for anything. I don't know if you know that. It's probably a nod at the American obsession with having a middle initial. And there's another S in a middle initial that doesn't stand for anything. It's the one that is in the middle of the American president's name, Harry S. Truman. The S didn't stand for anything, go figure. In any event, let me tell you a bit about Robert Peary. It's important because in the world at large, he's remembered as a formidable corporate M&A lawyer and as the director of the New York branch of the French Rothschild Bank. But for my purposes, he was a bibliophile. That's what I remember him for. He was a lover of books. with a private library of thousands of volumes and manuscripts, a collection he gladly made available for librarians and for scholars. People like Piri are an inspiration to people like me. Piri died in January of 2015, and in December of that year his library went up for sale at Sotheby's. I believe that this copy that I've been showing you, this copy of Three Imposters, was sold at the auction at Sotheby's, but I actually obtained it from a book dealer in San Francisco at a very, very nice discount when business began to dry up at the beginning of COVID. So I'm quite happy with this book. I bought it in May of 2020. And take a look at the dedication page. The dedication page here in the book, let's have a look. Here we go. That's the dedication page. If you can see it there, it's probably very small for you if you're watching the live, but I'm show you an image of it because I've got it here. Carly very kindly printed it up for me before we began, and we'll show it on the YouTube as well. That's the dedication page. The dedication page of Three Imposters, it was dedicated to the British Secretary of State at the time in 1669. His name was Henry Bennet. He was the first Earl of Arlington. Now, this is what he looked like, by the way. They all have these long and very luxurious wigs in those days. He was an English statesman, and why he would have been interested in the contents of this book is a little bit beyond me. I don't really quite get it, as you'll hear in a moment. We haven't yet got to the content of the book, but we will. Three Imposters is about what the title says. Three imposters who claim to be people, or were claimed to be people that they were not, at some point during the 17th century. It's just 126 pages long, so it's more of a pamphlet than a book, but in those days they published books in this size. It's a particular size of book. It was quite common to publish books in this size. The first 40 pages are taken up with the first two imposters. We'll hear about them in a moment. And the remaining 86 pages were devoted to the third imposter, who's by far the most fascinating of the three. Now, the first imposter of the three was not in fact a deliberate imposter, but the son of a woman called Zafira. Here's a picture of Zafira. Can you see her there? Zafira, who was on a Turkish ship that was bound for Egypt, for Alexandria, that was captured by Maltese warships in the Mediterranean in 1644. Now, for some reason, the Maltese sailors, the military sailors who were on the warships, thought that this woman, Zafira, was married to Ibrahim I, who at that time, in 1644, was the Sultan of Turkey. Here's a picture of Ibrahim I, and that her son, who was with her, a baby boy who was with her, was the heir to the Ottoman throne. Now, there is a reason why they thought that, because in fact, there were a number of passengers on the ship that Zafira was on who were connected to the harem of the Ottoman Sultan, and particularly the head eunuch, who was actually heading to exile, but they didn't know that. And he was quite a well-known character, and as a result, they imagined that this woman with a child was connected to the Ottoman Sultan, and that she was the Sultan of Turkey was sending her to Egypt for whatever reason, and they kidnapped her. Kidnapping, by the way, was a big thing in the 17th and 18th century, particularly in the Mediterranean. There were a lot of pirates who worked for states, for countries, for empires, but they would kidnap passengers on a ship and they would ransom them to earn money. And they thought that her son, this Zafira's son, whose name was Osman, was the heir to the Ottoman throne. Well, Zafira wasn't the Ottoman Sultan's wife, and her son wasn't his heir, but in any event, that's what they thought. This naval battle, let me tell you, in 1644, it's called the Action. This particular battle, the Maltese warships taking these Turkish ships in the middle of the Mediterranean, it triggered a bitter military war campaign that lasted for 24 years between Venice, which was its own little republic in that northern part of Italy between Venice and the Turkish Empire. You see, Venice was implicated in this action because they allowed the Maltese warships to dock the captured vessels in their port. And this war that resulted went on for 24 years. Now, long before that war was over, just a few years later, in 1648, Sultan Ibrahim was deposed and in fact he was executed. Zafira, who was not actually his wife, as we've said, died in the war. I think by 1645, January 1645, she was dead. And the young boy, her son, I think he was not that old. He was 3, 4, 5 years old. He was a young man, was sent to a monastery in Malta where he became known as Padre Ottomano, the Ottoman priest. And here's a portrait of him. Here's a picture I can show you of Padre Ottomano, the Ottoman priest. That's him in his 20s. He became a Catholic. Now, Padre Ottomano became a bit of a celebrity. He visited the Pope in Rome. He came to visit King Louis in Paris, the King of France. The Catholic faithful loved it, that the son of an Ottoman Muslim Sultan was a Catholic priest, even though he certainly was not the Sultan's son. And that's in fact what John Evelyn says in this book. So let's have a look here at three imposters. Here we have Padre Ottomani. He's the first of the three imposters. And the truth is that Padre Ottomano never made the claim to be Ibrahim's son, but he went along with it. And he actually died a young man. He was only 34 years old, according to most accounts. He died in 1676. So it's a bit of a tragic story. Doesn't take up much room in this little book. But it's an interesting story about a minor celebrity based on a fake identification in the 17th century. The second poster of the three imposters in this little booklet is a more colourful character referred to by John Evelyn as Mohammed Bey. Mohammed Bey, that's his name. But his real name was Juan Mikhail Sigala. I don't know what his real name was, but that's actually the name that he's known by, because he certainly wasn't Mohammed Bey. He was a charlatan. Here's some pictures of him. Look at him here. Here's one picture of him as a slightly younger man. And then we have a picture of him as a slightly older man. This is what he looked like. He was a very interesting person. He was a charlatan. He masqueraded as a prince of the Ottoman family because he said he was a descendant of Emperor Suleiman the Magnificent. That's what he claimed. And there's another image of him which I found online, which is this one, in a grand posture. He's on a horse and he looks extremely impressive there. So this fellow, Sigala, was a charismatic Romanian adventurer who was born Christian. He went into the Ottoman Empire because Romania was bordered the Ottoman Empire. He converted to Islam, dressed in Ottoman clothes, and then paraded himself through various European royal courts as an Ottoman prince who had converted from Islam to Christianity. Of course, he'd never converted to one nor to the other. He was born Christian. He probably was a fake convert to Islam. And he certainly never converted back to Christianity, but he was probably never that devout a Christian in the first place. He was eventually exposed in London in 1668, and that's what Evelyn writes in his book. But it is the third imposter that makes this book really, really interesting for you and for me watching this, The Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. And he takes up most of the book. His name is Shabtai Tzvi. And as I've written about in my book, Mavericks, Mystics and False Messiahs, Shabtai Tzvi exploded onto the scene in the 17th century in 1665. There's a picture of him. This is actually a picture that was taken from the German edition of Evelyn's book. This is a picture they included in that version. I don't have it in my English version. But it begins, this is a title page of the book. Now you can see the name Shabtai Tzvi here. We're going to put a little finger here when we have the video on YouTube so that you can see it. That's the Shabtai Tzvi. He's the third imposter of the three that are included in this book. But here we begin the history. This is the title page, or the first page, page 41 of the book Three Imposters, in which John Evelyn begins to tell the tale of Shabtai Tzvi. And this is how John Evelyn begins the story. Remember, he's writing in the late 1660s, within a matter of a couple of years of when this story actually happened. Listen carefully. According to the predictions of several Christian writers, this is what he's saying, especially those who comment on the Apocalypse or Revelations, the year 1666 was meant to be a year of wonders, of strange revolutions in the world, and particularly of blessings to the Jews, either in respect of their conversion to the Christian faith or of their restoration to their temporal kingdom. In this manner, millions of people were possessed when Shabtai Tzvi first appeared at Smyrna in Turkey and publicized himself to the Jews as their Messiah, relating the greatness of their approaching kingdom, the strong hand whereby God was about to deliver them from bondage and gather them from all parts of the world. And Evelyn writes that he saw firsthand, he lived in London, remember? He saw firsthand among Jews he knew in England, they actually began to wind down their affairs in preparation for the Messianic redemption. It's an incredible thing. We daven every day for the Messianic redemption. We daven for the Geula. We daven for Oiseh Shalom B'Mroimov, for Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu, V'Yerushalayim Irecha Barachmim Toshuv, V'Sechzeno Eineinu B'Shuvcha L'Tzion Barachmim. We believe in the Mashiach. That we end off every drosha, we say that Mashiach Tzidkenu should come, B'Mheira V'Yameinu Amen. And here were people who heard that the Mashiach had appeared in Smyrna in Turkey. And they began to behave in a way that Jews should behave if Mashiach comes. And this is being written by a Gentile in the late 1660s as it's happening. Listen to what he says. I perceived a strange transport in the Jews, none of them attending to any business unless to wind up former negotiations and to prepare themselves and families for a journey to Jerusalem. Jews living in London, probably in luxury. There were no Jews in London who were living there because it was a hospitable environment. They were living there because they could do business there and they were successful. And they wound down their affairs. All their discourses, he says, their dreams and disposal of their affairs tended to no other design but a re-establishment in the land of promise to greatness, glory, wisdom and doctrine of the Messiah. It's very, very heartwarming. It's of course a tragic story because he was a false Messiah, an imposter, as John Evelyn says. But it's heartwarming to know that the Jewish faith was so strong that people were willing to wind up their affairs and to get themselves ready for Mashiach Tzidkenu. Evelyn is also one of the first sources of information regarding Shabtai Tzvi's family, regarding his failed first two marriages, his first meeting with the false messianic prophet Nathan of Gaza, Nathan's prediction that Shabtai Tzvi would meet the Sultan of Turkey, take his crown away from him and become the king of the Jews, leading them all back to the promised land and to rebuild the temple. So we have this information happening in real time, reported to us by John Evelyn, this guy who mixes with the hoi polloi, with the high-flying aristocrats of England. And what is very interesting is that John Evelyn shows how even Nathan was aware of Shabtai Tzvi's manic episodes. Of course, he suffered from mental illness, we know that now. But they were aware of the fact then that he was very strange. And in the transcript of a letter that's recorded in Three Imposters, translated and recorded right here in Three Imposters, Nathan writes to the Jews of Aleppo, though you have heard strange things of our Lord, speaking about Shabtai Tzvi, yet let not your hearts faint or fear, and rather fortify yourselves in your faith, because all of his actions are miraculous and secret. Well, they have to be secret if you can't understand them and they make no sense, which human understanding cannot comprehend. This is what Nosson Azati, Nathan of Gaza, is writing to the Jewish community of Aleppo in 1666. And who can penetrate into the depths of them? And Evelyn talks about how Nathan directed people to do acts of penance. It's right here in the pages of this book. It's absolutely fascinating. And many people did these crazy things, really crazy stuff. Some of them fasted, for example, for a full week. In fact, a few of them died as a result of fasting, with not eating for a whole week. Others buried themselves in their gardens, covered their bodies with earth. Only their heads were exposed, according to what Evelyn writes here, staying until their bodies were stiffened with cold and moisture. Others melted hot wax onto themselves or rolled themselves in snow, and in the coldest season of winter jumped into the sea or into frozen waters. It's all of it written in here. Now, of course, I don't expect you to buy this book. In fact, even if you wanted to, it's really hard to find, and you probably couldn't buy it. But I've actually discovered, and that's what I want to share with you, I've discovered that the full text of the book has actually been transcribed and is available on the internet. You don't need to buy the book. I bought it, I've got it, but you can find it on the internet. You can have this book on the internet, and the link is going to be posted on the comments in this chat. It's going to be up there on your screen. It's going to be in the comments on YouTube. So you can click on the link and you can read John Evelyn's book, and you can see everything he has to say in 1669 in real time about Shabtai Tzvi. And it's worth taking the time to read it. John Evelyn was an English Gentile who was so taken by the Shabtai Tzvi story that he wrote about it, not just a few words. You know, Samuel Pepys also mentions Shabtai Tzvi in his diaries, but it's just a few words. It's one or two sentences. But Evelyn devoted most of a book to the story of this crazy rabbi who pretended to be Mashiach, and the sad consequences of thousands of Jews. He says millions, by the way. I don't know if there were millions, but tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of Jews all over the world, believing that the Geulah, the redemption, had arrived when it hadn't. And this contemporary account is not history. You've got to understand that. It's not history. It is news reporting. And that's what makes it so important. Of course, as we know, John Evelyn was right. Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam rather than be executed by the Sultan Mehmet of Turkey. By the way, he was the real son of Ibrahim I, and he became the Sultan in 1648 for many decades. And Shabtai Tzvi died in 1676. He was in complete obscurity by that time. It's a few years after this book was published. We don't even know where he's buried, but the damage he caused, the Messianic redemption episode, this fake imposter Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi, caused so much damage that it lasted for more than a century. And you know I know about it because you know how much I've written and spoken about it in the past. It's a fascinating topic. Here we have another live example, as it were, of that particular episode from our history. Okay, let's look at another piece. Here we have it. It's fascinating. Can you see this? You see what it says here? Torah Nevi'im Kesuvim. It's Tanakh. It's a very, very important publication of Tanakh. It's a piece of history. It looks like a standard Chumash or Tanakh. It's in fact a piece of history, and for more than one reason. Firstly, it's a first edition. It was published in 1953. Here's the title page. Carly's going to put it up there on the screen as well when we have this on YouTube. It was published in 1953 by the Magnus Press of the Hebrew University, and they published it. It's the Kasuto edition of Chamisha Chumshei Torah and Nevi'im and Kesuvim. It's a very important publication. And here we have the the inside title page, which has got the publication details. It's a first edition. You're going to think to yourself, okay, 1953, first edition, who cares? It's important. It was such a big deal, this book, when it came out, that it made the New York Times. Here is the article from the New York Times that came out when this Tanakh was published. Jerusalem, May 10th. That's when the story ran. This is the May 11th, 1953 edition of the New York Times. Publication of the Jerusalem Bible, which was edited by Professor Umberto Kasuto and is the first revision of the Hebrew text of the Old Testament by a Jewish scholar, printed in Jerusalem, was announced today by Sir Leon Simon, chairman of Hebrew University's Magnus Press. The idea of publishing this Bible originated in 1929, when the late Judah L. Magnus founded the university's press. Sir Leon said that the new Bible, containing nearly 20,000 minute corrections or variations of vowel pointings and accenting of the Hebrew, was intended as a new standard household text. The Hebrew alphabet contains no vowels. These are indicated by points placed around the consonants. The accents, used only in biblical texts, indicate the correct way of reading the Bible aloud and sometimes affect the meaning. No other form of punctuation is used. At present, the text published by the British and Foreign Bible Society in the middle of the last century, that would have been the 19th century, in the 1800s, is the most widely accepted text. The Ginsberg text, published later by the Oxford University Press, is considered more scholarly. Professor Kasuto died in 1951. Spent much of his life collating the Ginsberg text with early biblical manuscripts, in particular the Leningrad manuscript, the Cairo manuscript, and the London manuscript. In addition, he was the first scholar to work on the famous manuscript preserved in the cellar of the synagogue of Aleppo, Syria, what we today call the Aleppo Codex, and that's, of course, a much longer story, whatever happened to the Aleppo Codex. We know that Aleppo no longer really exists. The Aleppo community certainly no longer exists. The Aleppo Codex is a very interesting story. Perhaps we'll devote a lecture to that in the future. But he found valuable, although he could not confirm the tradition, that it was written by the great biblical authority Aaron ben Moshe ben Asher. Finally, he examined the text preserved in Rome, where he was professor of the Bible before joining the Hebrew University staff in 1938. Now, this new edition, says the New York Times, was produced by transferring Professor Kasuto's corrections to photostatic copies of the Ginsberg edition and reproducing the corrected pages on photographic plates. The corrections were transferred by Yerachmiel Schechter of the New Betzalel School of Arts in Jerusalem under the supervision of Professor Kasuto's lifelong collaborator, Professor Hartom. That's the story of this, and this is the first edition of the Kasuto Tanakh that came out in 1953. So it's very, very important, and you understand that this in and of itself is a piece of history without me telling you a little bit more about this copy. Kasuto, by the way, was a very interesting man. I'm going to show you a picture of him. Here you go. You see that? It's a picture of Professor Kasuto. I'm not sure how clearly you can see it. But he was Professor Umberto Kasuto, or he's also known as Rabbi Moshe David Kasuto, in his later years when he lived in Jerusalem. What do you think? Can you see it there? I'm not sure if you can see it. His curled up moustache, like Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot. Can you imagine anyone taking someone like that seriously today with having a curly moustache? I'm not sure. It's a bit of a joke moustache. But anyway, this is serious, by the way. This is him living in Jerusalem in the 1940s. He was the chief rabbi of Florence, but he had to leave in 1938 because of the racial laws. Of course, it was a fascist government run by Mussolini. And he became the professor of Bible literature at Hebrew University in 1938. He was also the first person to deconstruct the critical hypothesis of Wellhausen and others. You know, they came up with this idea that the Torah was written by multiple different authors, and at a much later time than to Mount Sinai and during the period of the prophets, but he deconstructed all the theories that had been elevated by the works of Wellhausen and his fellow travellers, and he was one of the original sources of an academic refutation of Wellhausen. In any event, he was a devout man, a very frum man, and he was also a very knowledgeable scholar of the Tanakh. Kasuto, as we heard in the New York Times article, died in 1951, 2 years before his Chumash, his Tanakh, was published. But you should know something. All Chumashim to this day, since 1953, are based on the text that he came up with, because it was so well put together. He put so much effort into it. And this is long before there were computers. He was doing everything by hand. He was comparing different texts by hand and making corrections by hand. This is the product of his years and years of work. Most importantly, this Chumash, this Tanakh, became the official Tanakh of Medinat Yisrael, of the State of Israel, and visiting dignitaries from every country and every walk of life were given copies at the time, always with a dedication from the Prime Minister. Now, who was the Prime Minister of Israel in 1953? None other than David Ben-Gurion. Can you see him there? There's a picture of David Ben-Gurion. He ordered a bunch of copies of the Kasuto Tanakh and gave them to distinguished personalities with his handwritten personal greetings. And this copy that I'm holding here is one of those copies. That's what it is. This is a copy given by David Ben-Gurion. This Kasuto Tanakh was given by him to the chairman of the British retailer, Marks and Spencer. His name was Marcus Sif. He was a dear friend. Here we go. Sorry, wrong way. Marcus Sif was a dear friend of David Ben-Gurion, and he was one of the world's leading Zionists and supporters of the new state of Israel at that time. And David Ben-Gurion gave it to him at the 1953 Jerusalem conference, which took place in Jerusalem. And it was focused, the Jerusalem conference was a very, very important conference at the beginning of the state of Israel. It was focused around a 7-year program of infrastructure building in the new country, water, roads, building projects, and much more. It gave a foundation to the infrastructure for the country at that time. Marcus Sif was a big supporter of that project, and he came to Jerusalem in 1953. By the way, at the very beginning of the State of Israel, he was in the State of Israel helping them with their financing. He, of course, came from a very wealthy family, the Sif family that founded one of the biggest retailers in the UK, Marks and Spencer, and he took over. He died in 2001. He got this in 1953. Here's a copy of the dedication page. I'm going to read it to you. And you should leave the image up on there, Carly, when we put this on YouTube. To Mr. Marcus Sif of London, in appreciation of your participation in the Jerusalem Conference of 1953, with the compliments of the Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, Jerusalem, October 25th to 29, 1953. Also in Hebrew, here you can see there with David Ben-Gurion's signature that he gave a personal dedication. I'm going to show it to you in the actual book itself. Here it is. It's there in the title page. It's an added page that was put in there for the government copies. The government copies of the Kasuto Tanakh, so that the Prime Minister could insert his dedication. Now, Lord Sif, I said, died in 2001, and his personal library was dispersed. Somehow this Ben-Gurion dedicated copy of the Kasuto Tanakh found its way into a charity auction some years later, a few years ago, and a family member of mine bought it for me. It's behind me here in this office. It's a piece of Jewish history. It's wonderful to have it in close proximity. I'm now going to turn to an extremely rare pamphlet by Reverend Benjamin Shevzik of London. Here we have it. I'm not sure how much you can see here in this light. Benjamin Shevzik of London. It's a series of tshuvos in Hebrew with a translation, a version of it in English as well. You have here is the Hebrew title page, and here is the English title page. I'm not sure if you can see it, of this very, very rare pamphlet regarding cremation in Jewish law. That's what the subject matter is of this particular pamphlet. Now, it's so rare, and I researched this during the research for this episode of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library, and I saw that it actually went on auction at a Kestenbaum auction in 2001, and it had an estimate at the time of $100 to $150, and it sold in 2001, that's 20 years ago, it sold for $850. So I'm not sure how many copies of this there are in the world. Now, cremation, burning of corpses, is a great challenge. Jewish law forbids it, but assimilated Jews don't understand why. Here in LA, for example, I'm just telling you, I'm a rabbi here in LA, there are whole sections of the Jewish cemeteries where ashes are interred because Jewish people opt for cremation. It's not a new problem. Clearly, it's not a new problem because Rabbi Shevtzik wrote and published this very pamphlet, in 1889, and he answers 7 questions. Here is the back page in English. I just showed it to you. I'm going to read you a couple of the questions. Is it permitted for a man to give direction for his body to be burnt after his death? And when is he considered on this account to be wicked? That's question number 1, dealt with in a tshuva, in a very, very well-written tshuva in this particular pamphlet. Do persons act thus on account of their disbelief in immortality and in future judgment, or on account of scientific reasons, in order to prevent putrefaction setting in? So he's giving the 2 sides as to why it might be. Is it because they reject God, or is it because they've got some scientific reason? They're just not aware of the faith obligations that they have as Jews. Are we permitted to cremate the body of a person who has directed that this should be done? What do you do if it's in the last will and testament of a person that they must be cremated? What is the halacha? That's what he's answering. These are questions that he was obviously being asked. And by the way, these are questions that rabbis, including me, continue to be asked even 130 years later. This pamphlet was published in 1889, and I am still being asked by cremation to this day. May we bury people who are cremated in proximity of other graves, or do they require to be removed at a distance from those who have acted as good Jews? Etc. Another 3 or 4 questions here that he asks, but you see that the questions haven't changed, and he gives the tshuva. Now, I have to tell you that Binyamin Shevtzik may have been a rabbi, but he was also actually the proprietor of Shevtzik's Russian vapor baths at 86 to 88 Brick Lane, directly opposite the great Spitalfields Synagogue. Here it is. Here's a picture of those vapor baths, steam baths. And the great Spitalfield Synagogue was also known as Machzikei Hadas. By the way, that was the shul where Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook, later the chief rabbi of Palestine and one of the most distinguished rabbis of the 20th century, he was for 3 years, between 1916 and 1919, the Rav of the Machzikei Hadas, opposite Shevtzik's vapor baths in the East End. Here is the actual sign that was outside the Russian vapor baths of the Shevtzik family that was owned and run by this Rabbi Binyamin Shevtzik. You know who else was the Rav of Machzikei Hadas? Dain Yecheskel Abramsky. Rabbi Yecheskel Abramsky, who authored Chazon Yecheskel on Tosefta, was the Rav of Machzikei Hadas, also opposite the same place. According to the Jewish Museum in London, you can check this out, there's blurb online, the Shevtzik steam baths were an important part of social and religious life in the East End of London, and were mostly used by men following work on a Friday afternoon before Shabbos, before they went to synagogue for prayers. Now, I know of only one other publication by Shevtzik, a eulogy he gave for Chief Rabbi Nosson Marcus Adler, Evel Kovod it's called, in February 1890. Here it is, this pamphlet, and here's a portrait of Rav Adler, which is available online. I have various other images as well. Here it is. portrait of Nosson Marcus Adler, very choshev arov. He was the chief rabbi of Great Britain and the British Empire from 1845 until 1890. He died at the beginning of 1890 in Shvat. And what's interesting about him is the last 10 years of his life, he wasn't that active. He lived in Brighton on the south coast of England. And his son, Herman Naftali Adler, took over his duties. And we're going to hear in a moment, it's very interesting. He became the chief rabbi in 1891. He died in 1911. And we've spoken about him in other contexts because of the book I published about Rav Hillman last year. And he is mentioned in that context because he was not quite as sympathetic towards the frum immigrants as his father had been. His father was much more sympathetic, having himself been an immigrant and having himself been brought up in a very, what we would today call a Haredi home, and understanding the importance of the frum and very observant Orthodox Jewish community. In any event, this pamphlet records the hesped that was given by Rav Sheftik, the owner, the proprietor of the vapor baths in the East End, that he gave. It says on the front cover that he taught at the Lady Judith Montefiore College at Ramsgate. He gave the hesped at the East London Synagogue in Stepney, which, by the way, was the first purpose-built United Synagogue. It was built in 1877, and it closed down in 110 years later, in 1987. By that time, of course, there weren't that many people living in the East End of London. It was an area that the Jewish community had declined, and it closed in 87, and the membership was merged with other shuls in the area, shuls which have also since closed. Sheftik said a number of interesting things in this hesped, in this little pamphlet. And we've got, by the way, an English page title, which you've got here, and the Hebrew title page. So the English title page says, "A Grievous Mourning, a sermon in memory of the late Chief Rabbi Nathan Adler, Zatzal, preached in the East London Synagogue by the Rev B. Sheftik of the Judith College in Ramsgate on the 12th of Shvat 5650, February the 2nd, 1890. And it was published. He said some interesting things. As I said, that Rabbi Naftali, Rabbi Herman Adler, had taken his father's place for the previous few years. His father had been in declining health. But he says in this hesped that, in fact, Herman Adler is going to take his father's position as chief rabbi, and this was at least a year or more before he was officially elected to that position. Officially, it was not something that was just given to him by rights. He had to be nominated, and there had to be other candidates, and he was elected. But Rabbi Sheftik said that he's certainly going to take the position of his father. And it's interesting that the pamphlet is in Hebrew and in English, because I'm almost certain that Sheftik gave his hesped, the way I can see it in the Hebrew, he must have given it in Yiddish, but clearly he didn't feel it was appropriate to publish in that language, so he publishes the main hesped, the main version of the hesped in Hebrew, and an abbreviated translation in English. Now, while we're on the subject of hespedim for Chief Rabbi Adler, I want to share this last volume with you, which I think is absolutely fascinating. The piece that I want to show you is very fascinating. It's a volume that I bought many years ago from my dear friend Moshe Leib Weiser, who passed away sadly from COVID 3/4 of a year ago. It's a series of pamphlets that were published by a man called Rabbi Yosef Cohen-Zedek. Rabbi Yosef Katz, he was a descendant of Rav Naftali Katz, the Smichas Chachomim, and other great luminaries. He was an Austro-Hungarian rabbi. He was born in Galicia somewhere. He moved to England in later life in 1875, but he was born in 1827 and had died in London in 1903. He got smicha from Rabbi Yosef Shol Natanzon, the chief rabbi of Lemberg, Lvov today, Lviv. In Lemberg, he wrote a few Hebrew poems. He began to publish. He was a great scholar of Hebrew. He edited a volume in honor of Sir Moses Montefiore. He wrote a hesped for the Sar Sholem, the first Rebbe of Belz with whom he was related. Don't forget, the Sar Sholem was also descended from the Smichas Chachomim, from Reb Naftali Katz. He wrote this piece on Moshe Montefiore was called Nevei Tehillah. Tzedek spoke fluent Hebrew long before that was a normal thing to do. Nobody spoke Hebrew. He could speak a conversational Hebrew. Fascinating man. He became a Magid Shir. He gave shiurim at yeshivas in Krakow, in Altona, which is in Germany, it's next to Hamburg, as well as in Frankfurt am Main. He was a very well-known Maggid Shir, a fantastic darshan. And he came to London in 1875, in his late 30s, and in that city, in London, he became very well known as a Maggid and as a teacher, and he published, all of these works were I believe all of these ones in here were published in London. And over the years, I've seen many of them come up in auctions, but here they are all bound in one volume. It's a marvellous... It's absolutely marvellous. I've got here Musa Haskell, for example, which is a collection of his droshes. I've got Ur Chodosh. Let me find Ur Chodosh. Hold on a moment. Let me just see where that is. No, this is Ohel Hashem. Ohel Hashem is actually an account of the trial of Yaakov ben Yitzchak in the city of Madrid in the year 550. He was accused of the murder of a Christian child in order to obtain its blood for Jewish ritual purposes. It's quite an odd thing. Very curious the way it's written. Trying to look here for Ohel Hashem, I'm not sure. I've got his Sfas Emes. Sfas Emes is a very strong polemic. It's against Rodkinson. Rodkinson, who was the first person to translate the Gemara. Has anyone got a Rodkinson? If you've got a Rodkinson, it's I don't know how many, 20 volumes. Very bad translation, the first ever translation to English of the Gemara. And he wrote an incredibly scathing review, Rabbi Yosef Cohen-Zedek, of something that was written by Rodkinson, who was himself an interesting man. He was a Chassid of Lubavitch who went completely off the derech, and he later on ended up in New York. He married a non-Jew and is buried in a non-Jewish cemetery somewhere in New York. Somebody wants to send me a picture of his grave. I'd be fascinated to see it. In any event, the reason why this is interesting and why it's related to Binyamin Sheftik is because it contains another account or hesped of the death of Rabbi Nosson Adler. It's one of the most fascinating publications I have ever seen in my life. I'm not saying that lightly. You know how many very interesting things I've seen. This book is actually totally fascinating. It is called Elef Alfin. And Elef Alfin is in fact a hesped that was written for Adler, for Reb Nosson Marcus Adler, with every single word, and it's many pages. Every single word of this book starts with an aleph. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Every single word, I'll read it to you. Elef Alfin, Igeres Evel. Elef Alfin means 1,000 alephs, a letter of mourning. Azkara, memorial, El Ish Eshkulois, of this great man, Erez Adir, a mighty cedar, Abir Abirim, Oihev Emes, Emunase, Emunas Oimen, Efrasi, Avoisav, Adire Ayuma, Adoinenu, Oirenu, not Oironu, Oirenu, Alufenu, Adler. He doesn't say Nosson and Marcus because then he'd have to use a nun and a mem. So he just calls him Adler. Abad, Arzois, Anglia, Aruka, Agapeo, Iyeho, Asher Ezin, Imre Emes, Elafike, Unculus. Echteveno, Asadreno, Atviseno, Onoichi, Osof, Aharoini, Amiti, Ish Austria. He doesn't give his real name. We know it was him. And then at the bottom it's got the publication. It's absolutely fascinating. It says here, the Reverend David Cohen-Zedek, who's the son of the author, here it is in English. Hopefully we'll have an image of that when we put this up on YouTube. Remarked in his lecture held on Sunday the 26th of Shvat at the Jerusalem Synagogue at 81 Greenfield Street that the number of the present year coincided with three Hebrew words. Hanesher HaGodol Zecher Tzadik HaKodesh Livrocha, which he thought would be right and proper to be by everyone who makes use of Hebrew correspondence as a prat. It's one of the most fascinating hespedim you've ever read in your life. I'm not sure it's available online. It may be on Hebrew Books, I don't know. Oyo achai, artseinu ovda oitzar, avedas algumim oy almugim, ofeis af ovdan avnei ekda, oidem oy achlama, oyin, avol aho Es Adonenu alufeinu avadnu adler ishoin oirenu einenu. Im amarti avligo ekra el evel oir oizen anoshim el anchosi aspidehu avakehu akoinanehu osoif esoif imre agodois ava arehem. You can see every single word starts with an aleph. This man must have been an absolute genius. I don't know how long it must have taken him to put this together, but it's totally fascinating. And with that, we will end this, the second episode of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. I'm extremely grateful to you for watching. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the next episode, where I will have more treasures from the Rabbi's Library to share with you. Thank you.